Hello and welcome to another session of the Law and Democracy podcast hosted by the Election Law at Ohio State University team. I'm Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of the Election Law program here at Ohio State. And today I'm joined by Terry Enns, Matt Cooper, and Tony Goggin, Senior Fellows of the Election Law program here at OSU. And then we're delighted today to be able to welcome as a special guest Timothy Gabrielli, who is a theologian, and we're looking forward to talking to him about the recent selection of a new pope as a point of interesting comparison about electoral processes. Tim is an associate professor of theology at the University of Dayton, where he holds the Gudorf chair in Catholic intellectual traditions. Tim, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Tony, tell us what we're looking forward to talking about today a little more.
Today our topic is the conclave. About 2 weeks ago, the Roman Catholic Church elected a new pope, Pope Leo, the first American pope in history. And so we're going to take advantage of Tim's expertise today and learn more about the conclave and the election processes that have resulted in our new pope. And so with that, I might begin with the first question, Tim, which is just a very basic question. In general terms, what is a conclave?
Sure. So, literally the word means with key from the Latin. And it's a process by which all of the cardinals of the Catholic Church who are under 80 years old gather. They're from around the world, and they gather in now the Sistine Chapel. And there's some introductory things that go on. There's some prayers and a mass that leads into the thing. But once it starts, those folks are locked in there. So hence the with key. So those cardinals are locked in the Sistine Chapel and the adjacent Casa San Marta where they stay. And other than some folks who are there to kind of provide the necessities, no one else is permitted in, and no one goes out until a pope is elected. And there are no slates of candidates formally established, and each cardinal receives a piece of paper that in front of them that says this is for whom, this is the person I elect to be pope, and they write whatever name they want. And strictly speaking, they could identify any baptized male. Now, more commonly, it's someone from among their own number, that is the cardinals of the Catholic Church who are under 80. And so they do that on the first day. This past conclave, when they entered the conclave, they have an opportunity that afternoon to do an initial ballot. That's an option they have. They have taken it the past few conclaves, and when the cardinals have to agree on a 2/3 majority of the group that's there. And so on that first ballot, they did not get to 2/3. And so they burn the ballots after they count them very carefully. We can talk more about that if you want. They burn the ballots, and there's a little chimney installed in the Sistine Chapel, and out comes smoke. They mix some chemicals with the ballots to give us black smoke if there's no pope. And when there is finally a pope, as we saw just about 2 weeks ago on Thursday afternoon, there's white smoke. And so that first day, there's one ballot, and then they break for the day. The subsequent days, there are 2 ballots in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, and that continues until there is a pope elected. I think after 3 days, if it would go on that long, they would take a break for prayer and reflection and discussion. But I think the key thing also to remember is that, the in-between, the passing each other in the hallways, the sharing meals together around the tables, a lot of that is where the small p kind of politicking happens, the conversations about where the names are headed, who's getting attention. The candidates kind of emerge almost organically through that process. So, of course, I could say a lot more, but maybe that gives you the overview.
So I know I've got several questions that arise just from that helpful overview, Tim. Can you just clarify couple of things that both relate to the way in which the cardinals themselves might be conversing with one another. And I'm sure sometimes it could be simple exchange of ideas and information. Other times it might be more sort of lobbying and trying to twist some arms or bend some ears a little bit. But what are the opportunities for that sort of conversation? So on the first day, that afternoon, when they have an initial vote, if it doesn't immediately result in a 2/3 selection, is there a lot of conversation that evening? Then the next morning, if they don't get 2/3 vote on the first ballot of that morning, would they defer from having the second ballot of that morning until they've had opportunity for discussion, or do they just immediately go into the second ballot of the day that morning? How does it actually play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So after let's just talk about the most recent one. So after Pope Francis passed on, all the cardinals began to make their way to Rome from around the world. And one of the really interesting things about Pope Francis's papacy, especially vis-a-vis this election process, is that he really internationalized the cardinalate. I mean, there were 20 countries that had cardinals that had never had cardinals before. And there's a kind of sense in the church that certain important cities and dioceses have cardinals associated with them, like Milan, for example, in Italy, and Washington, D.C. here, and of course other places around the world that are prominent. But Pope Francis really made an effort to name cardinals in less prominent places. So from across the globe, those cardinals make their way to Rome, and many of them are there for the Pope's funeral. The regulations are that the conclave has to start between 15 and 20 days after the death of the Pope. And so they make their way to Rome. A number of them are there for the funeral. And then after that, they begin a series of what are called general congregations. And they have these meetings in which various cardinals give short speeches, usually 2 to 10 minutes, no longer than that, about their sense of the kind of state of the world and the state of the church. Pope Francis very famously gave this speech during that time period in which he talked about, we need a church that is not closed in on itself, but a church that goes out, a church that is in the streets, a church that is not self-referential, which became a real theme of his papacy. And a lot of folks said, well, that speech really was instrumental in getting him elected. But of course, these are distinguished from campaign sort of stump speeches, right? That would be seen as, untoward. But they're really sort of like sharing their impressions about what the state of the church is. And that's before they're locked away, right? That's kind of in the days before the conclave begins. So I think during that period, there's plenty of conversation and certain candidates start to emerge, I think, in people's minds. And then outside of the formal sessions, people are having pasta in Rome and they're, talking about, okay, what do you think of this guy? And what about that one? And of course, there are people who come to be recognized as like kingmakers, who are doing the work of, some of that whipping, you might call it. But then when they get in the conclave, the time in between the ballots. So on the first day, for example, in the afternoon, I think it was almost 9 o'clock Rome time, a little later than I expected, that we got the black smoke on the first day. So probably by that time, things are winding down and heading to bed. But, there may be some conversations. Then in the morning, before the first ballot, over breakfast, plenty of conversations. And then typically when there is those 2 ballots in the morning, typically it's one, then another. There really isn't a break time for chatting. It's simply kind of responding to what the names are. Then we do another and see if it changes. Then we take a break and we have lunch and we talk and we have espresso and we, chat about it.
Technical question and then bigger question, but technically, are each of the ballots read out so that are the totals so that everybody kind of knows from the get-go, like who's rising to the top, or is it we all voted? Here's the names that were in the list. We're going to vote again.
Yeah, yeah, that's excellent. There's actually a very formal process where there are three cardinals. So the dean of the College of Cardinals is the one who conducts the conclave, if he's in the conclave. Giovanni Battista Re is the dean, and he's 90, so he did not conduct the conclave. It was actually Pope Francis's Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, who was in charge of the conclave. So he sits in the middle, and there are two people who sit on either side of him. And there's this very formalized process where the ballots, each cardinal walks his ballot forward and puts it onto a little metal tray that gets put into a kind of urn-like thing. And when they're all in there, then one by one they're pulled out and shown to three people. So there's no discrepancy here. And the last person, and then they're read aloud as part of that process. One person looks at it, next person looks at it, third person reads it aloud, and then they put them all on a string, and they string them together before they're to be burned. So it's a very kind of formalized process, and they're read aloud. And usually then like people are keeping tallies, right? So they know who's rising, who's dwindling maybe in their candidacy.
Go ahead, Terry. Yeah.
Just to follow up, that means it really is a very secret ballot if everybody's putting it into something and then it's being pulled out. So you're not tying the vote to the voter. It's like we do, but it's secret.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. Exactly.
As a historical matter, have there been instances in which somebody has claimed that some kind of voting fraud has occurred, that somebody somehow managed to submit multiple ballots or anything like that?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I could say some other things about the history. I'm trying to think of that specific question. Of course, at one level, we wouldn't actually definitively know because all the cardinals are bound to secrecy. Now, there are always stories that come out. So in the conclave that elected Pope Francis, we learned later that I'm sorry. In the conclave that elected Pope Benedict before Francis, we later learned that Bergoglio, who was Pope Francis, was getting a number of votes, and the story goes that he stood up and said, "Stop voting for me," and then eventually Benedict was elected. Now, these things come out. If a cardinal discloses what happens in a conclave, then they are immediately excommunicated. So for someone to come public and say that, these things leak out anonymously. So whether we would know definitively is probably a difficult question. Though the conclave itself really developed like in the second millennium. In the first millennium of the Catholic Church, it was really, the faithful who would identify names, the bishops who would vet them, and then eventually bishops would choose from among their own the Bishop of Rome, who is the Pope. And the conclave really develops because of, as we all know, right, no one imagined the idea of the separation of church and state as we think about it today, before more than, 500 years ago or something, right? So there, of course, the Pope was a head of state, still is a head of state, but was a head of a much larger swath of the middle of Italy, the Papal States. And of course, there was lots of interest in who would be in that, almost monarchical kind of position. And so there was lots of interest from kings and princes and others trying to jockey for power. So it emerged as a process by which I think that to try to eliminate the external influences among the cardinals, and they were kind of eventually, as the process to elect from the cardinals came into being, then to eliminate outside influence. But even so, there remained certain rulers who had veto power. So up until the late 19th century, for example, Austria had a veto power. And from what we understand, they used it in the papal election in the late 19th century that elected, the early 20th century elected Pope Pius X, who then abolished it. And so whoever was the delegate from Austria stood up and said, on behalf of the Kingdom of Austria, we're using our veto power. And that's so there's been a lot of that. I say all that to say that the process really emerged because of the sense that there were many who wanted to influence this election and to try as best as they could to protect from that influence beyond at least the boundaries or the particular kinds of influences that would be allowed.
Thanks, Tim. I was kind of wondering about that history, but I'm also kind of wondering about the rules, the regulations for this, which I think I recall reading that there's an apostolic constitution where some of this is laid down. I'm wondering like how that document was created, if there was some sort of democratic like process, or if it was kind of created by a pope at some point or something else.
Yeah. So in the Catholic Church, ultimately, the Pope has supreme and universal authority. Insofar as even, if the Pope were to say something contrary to canon law, that would be new canon law. And so, and popes can be as consultative or not as they want to be. And of course, you all know better than I do, studying election law and understanding the way power works. That kind of juridical power doesn't always operate, de facto, right? The Roman curia means court. It remains a kind of place of various jockeying and for positions of power. But so there's all that kind of influence, and the Pope can say what the Pope wants to say about how the next conclave should unfold, and then it becomes that way. So, yes, the current document was written by John Paul II, and it was then revised a little bit by Benedict and by Francis. But those popes decided to revise that document and keep it mostly intact. Benedict and Francis, that is. They could have written a whole new one, and actually the establishment of a conclave, I believe, was a bull by a pope in the 13th century that established it. And then there have been several documents that have modified it over the ages. But the one that's enforced now was written by John Paul II, and then, as I say, modified by his successors. But just to give you, for instance, that document specified that the electors would be limited to 120. And just to give you a sense of the size here, in the early 20th century, in the 30s and 40s, we had somewhere around 40 or 50 cardinal electors, right? So over the last century, this has really expanded. And as I was saying earlier, Pope Francis really, I think, saw part of his mission to expand the cardinalate as part of his emphasis on the church on what he would call the peripheries, paying attention to those places that are overlooked, the flyover countries and such, and so as he expanded the cardinalate, we ended up with 132 cardinal electors this time, so well over the limit of 120, and the Pope does that, and so that's the new law, right? And so, the checks and balances here work very differently.
Tim, is there any other event in the Catholic Church that would bring together the 132 cardinals, or is it only the funeral of a pope and a conclave that brings together this electorate?
That's such a perceptive question, Tony, because this particular group hadn't been together very often before they gathered for the conclave. Now, there had been a practice under Pope Benedict, for example, to bring cardinals together more often for various meetings. Pope Francis didn't have that practice of calling these folks together. He had a group of 9 cardinals from around the world that served as something like a cabinet to him, and that was not an established body. He just put that into place. So he met with those folks relatively often. But one of the things I had said to a number of folks who were asking about the conclave leading up to it was that these cardinals really need to get to know one another. A lot of them didn't know one another. As a matter of fact, during those general congregation discussions before the conclave, there was a suggestion from the cardinals that they have name tags, and so they got name tags. So it's like, I keep these people straight. So I think and I said, I remember said to one journalist, well, this probably means we're going to have a longer conclave because they get to know one another. And of course, I was wrong, right? No one can predict what happens in a conclave.
I wonder if Pope Leo's name tag said, "Hello, I'm Bob."
My name is. um, what you've just described, when you were describing the conclave earlier, you said that they, quote, have to agree to a 2/3 majority. Is that part of, did you phrase it that way because of that sort of malleability, I guess, of the rules that govern this? Because I have some questions about that supermajority requirement.
No, I probably said it less felicitously than I could have. The document establishes that it must be 2/3 of the cardinal electors.
Okay, because I wonder how that influences the entire process to know that you have to get to a supermajority. You can't just chit chat over pasta for a few days and then go into the conclave and then 50% plus one takes it. It's got to be different than that. And do you have any thoughts or impression about the impact of that supermajority requirement?
Yeah, I think I'd be interested to hear, from you all your kind of thoughts about the difference that makes in studying elections. My sense of it is that, well, there are really two elements that come to mind here. One is that first ballot, whenever it's conducted, becomes very important, right? And so you have a sense of like, if you're thinking it's going to be candidate, Cardinal X, and Cardinal X only gets 10 votes out of 130 on the first crack, it's not looking too strong. And so on that first ballot, the ones who emerge become very significant. And then I just think it's so fascinating to think about, everybody listening to the results and think, okay, how has this played out and which way has it gone? And we expected it maybe to go more votes in this cardinal's direction. And as a matter of fact, it went this other way. But that opening ballot seems to me pretty determinative, because it's going to be, very hard to get to 2/3, as you say, than to try to get to, just a majority plus one. I mean, the other thing, and this isn't exactly related to the to the 2/3 per se, but there is a real sense from the Cardinals that they don't want to be in there very long, not because it's uncomfortable and they want to get home, though there's probably part of that too, but that they know the world is watching and they don't want to appear divided deeply. And so I think there is also a sense of, a kind of expeditiousness that drives the process. And then there's we should not forget, of course, that the whole thing here, that when the cardinals gather, they deliberately invoke the Holy Spirit. I mean, they're trying to, at least as they articulate it, they are trying to do what God is leading them to do. And so then paying attention to the ways things are unfolding, and this candidate got 40 votes. Who expected that, right? Well, we should pay attention. There's a kind of movement of the Spirit among us. And so I think, yes, there's the politicking part of it. Wherever humans are gathered, there are politics. But I do think that, and I do believe that many of them take this very seriously, that they are trying to pray and discern and listen to what God wants them to do. And so then that becomes an element, and they're kind of sorting through, whose name is popping up.
Now, the secrecy about it all still leaves it a little murky. I mean, what you've just described makes great sense and seems quite likely. But I think I can tell a counter story that, hypothetically, a first ballot that had 40 votes for Cardinal A and 30 votes for Cardinal B, and as you said, 10 votes for Cardinal C, and then a number of scattered votes for everybody else. And as you said, you might think, therefore, that Cardinal C, who only got 10 votes, is now consigned to not really being a viable candidate anymore. But I can imagine that if the two cardinals that were in the first two positions represent very different factions, if you will, and there's an effort to try to come to a rapid agreement that can be embraced by 2/3, that some kind of compromise candidate could emerge. And we've never known whether that's what's happening. And it could be that cardinal who only got 10% or somebody else. And it sort of was reminding me of the ways in which we have, as an election law team, talked about the difficulty of finding consensus candidates today. And so I'd really love to be able to unpack a little bit more of what goes on there, but I know I can't.
Right. I think that's right. Yeah. And I do think there are some, if we look over, the history of papal elections, there are some conclaves that produced what folks generally agree was a compromise candidate. For example, in 1958, Angelo Roncalli was elected Pope John the 23rd. And he was older at his election. And it seems that, again, we're all dealing with kind of stories that get told about this, but it seems that, the two leading candidates couldn't get enough support. And so over time, over a few days, it turns to, okay, well, if not this one and not that one, who could we get, 2/3 support for? And in that case, he emerged as someone who was a surprise. So we judge that from the outside by usually how long it takes, because the emergence and development of, as you're saying, Steve, a compromise candidate usually takes a little bit of time. So that absolutely can happen.
And Tim, are the proceedings at the conclave in Italian? What's the lingua franca, the language that they use to communicate, both formally and informally during the conclave?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are no translators, and so some of the cardinals, talked about being at a disadvantage because they may not know the same languages that the others do. There is no official language of the conclave, so many of the cardinals do speak Italian because of their connections to Rome. But a number of them hadn't been to Rome very often and didn't work in the Curia, and so a number of the cardinals speak English. Some speak French. They most of them know Latin, some better than others, from their studies that led them to this point. So it is it varies, I would say, and it's trying to find a language in which you can communicate isn't always the easiest.
I'm interested in circling back again to some of Terry's reflections and questions about the 2/3 supermajority requirement. How long has that been part of the process? Do you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'd have to go back and look, but I'm pretty sure that has been around for quite some time. I think since the establishment of a conclave, okay, which would have been like 13th century, but that's one I'd have to double check on.
It just strikes me really interesting as a way to get buy-in from the entire Catholic universe, right? Because we're operating in a democracy where you've got a president, the papal equivalent in some ways. The one person at the top represents 50% plus one is all it takes, but they're term limited, unlike a pope, right? There's a lot of reasons why the difference, but that 2/3 requirement, I have a whole mess of questions about, because I think it's so interesting in terms of what it does to the process. Anyways, yeah, sorry, Steve, I think you were going to follow up and I jumped in.
Well, I was just sort of curious, as a true historical matter, what we know about that 2/3 requirement. Terry, you articulated a certainly quite plausible, or more than plausible, underlying justification, which is to demonstrate to the entire church and to the world that this is a person that has broad support. And as Tim was describing, also a process that within the church is understood to be the result of some divine guidance or influence as well. And that just having a 50% or majority requirement would not work so well for those purposes. But that still leaves hanging what really is the historical story there, as opposed to just our postulating possibilities.
Yeah, I think that I think you touched on a good point there, Steve, that there is a sense, at least as we talk about it today, there is a sense that getting to 50% plus one is can be a kind of if you got enough elbow grease, you can get your way there. But I do think you're right, Steve, that this is connected to the sense that, well, if we're really going to try to pay attention to the way God is moving among us, well, then it's going to have to be more significant than that. And that's at least the way we talk about it today. As I say, that's a research question for me too, about its development.
I'm just thinking that would be an expensive way to run large elections, to have that 2/3 requirement. If you don't get it, you just do it again.
Well, I guess I come out of a religious tradition that operates on consensus, which is even more than 2/3. And I've been through some decision-making processes where that was what our goal was. And holy cow, it takes forever. And patience. Yeah. Anyway, you have to give a lot.
The 2024 election would still be going on right now if we were at 2/3 or certainly consensus requirement.
I think the 2016 would still be going on.
Only the 2000.
There would have to be different candidates, I think. Yeah.
Right.
Tim,
that was interesting.
Oh no, Matt, go ahead, and then I'll ask a follow-up.
Well, yeah, this is more of a comment. It was just interesting. And I was thinking about this, about when you were starting to talk about this, Tim, about the Holy Spirit kind of being really the guide to all of this, which I mean, that was striking me as a contrast between, elections kind of as we know them, where, voting is really more, what candidate is going to be the best for me and my family. At least some people think like that, in terms of economics. Though, I mean, there may still be thoughts of, okay, what candidate is the best for us as a country. But yeah, that does seem, and who knows, I guess, yeah, in theory, the Holy Spirit is guiding the cardinals. It may be kind of hard to discern, like, are there still like other kinds of thoughts about, what policies or what practices are going to be encouraged in the church. But that was just striking me as something interesting and quite different, I guess, in terms of like, at least like that's the universally, or at least among the cardinals, understood guide, whereas there could be all different kinds of motivations in kind of a popular election.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that too is nobody emerges from the conclave, maybe not nobody, almost no one emerges from the conclave saying we lost. And in elections, there are winners and there are losers. There aren't really any losers here. I mean, of course, there are in some sense, and we know, whose name. Apparently, one of the cardinals was overheard, who was over 80, and so not an elector, was overheard saying to Cardinal Parolin, who was Pope Francis' Secretary of State and considered something of a front runner, was overheard as Parolin was walking into the conclave saying, "Good luck, good luck." So. But nobody emerges saying, well, we'll get him next time and we'll do a post-mortem here. And how should we think about, of course, people have those thoughts. Absolutely. But that's not just how we come out of this thing. It's everybody is like, we have a pope and every cardinal takes a vow of obedience to him before he appears out on the loggia. And so, I think there is this sense of, I don't want to make too strong of a distinction between those things. I think that for many of the cardinals, right, the very human elements of the conclave, the conversations, is actually where one discerns the speaking of the Holy Spirit, right? It's not that we have these conversations over here and then we stop and we try to think, okay, is God speaking to me in some way? But no, it's actually through the very human mechanisms that emerges. So I think the voting itself is a mechanism in which, cardinals look around and say, okay, like through the way this vote is going, the Spirit is speaking. And so I think there's a willingness there, even from some of the more pugnacious and politicking cardinals to come off of it, to come off on the candidate they thought was the one, to be able to say, well, something is going on here that's bigger than me and emerging, and I should, pay attention to that.
That's really interesting, Tim, because it makes us view the 2/3 requirement in a different light, because we tend to view it from the front end perspective of what do I need to do to build a coalition to get to 2/3. Whereas, as I understand that point you just made, that by having a 2/3 requirement, that means on the back end, there's a lot more unity, because the prevailing candidate now knows a supermajority of the cardinals voted for them. And I presume that sort of people being people in all contexts, when you see a large majority moving towards a 2/3 vote, it wouldn't surprise me if, obviously this is all secrets, there's no way to know, but it wouldn't surprise me if typically the final result ends up being well north of 2/3, to even strengthen the sense of unity at the end. And I wonder, geographically, you mentioned how Pope Francis expanded the number of cardinals worldwide. Do we have a sense of I assume we do, what the breakdown is geographically around the world in terms of how many cardinals from South America, North America, Europe? I know Africa has seen tremendous growth. Is there a sense of, to get to 2/3, does that mean you have to win a number of continents, or win the votes of cardinals from a number of continents?
Yeah, that's right. The number of cardinals from Europe has declined over the past decades and really century. And I mean, Pope Francis was the first pope elected from outside of Europe in a very long time. Pope John Paul II in 1978 was the first non-Italian in a very long time. And so I think the kind of strength of Italy and then Europe as the kind of power center here has waned. So I think the electors in Europe were in the 50s this time out of 132. You can't get there even if you got all of Europe, and Europe is not united. And sometimes we do talk about, geographical regions as kind of, little blocks, but they're not identical. Folks did point to the fact that, Prevost, now Leo the 14th, is the first U.S. born, as we all know, Pope. But he spent much of his time in Peru, and had really made a good impression among the Latin American, South American cardinals. And so, that really bolstered his candidacy, I think, from what we understand. Somebody made an off the cuff comment that it was well north of 100 votes that he got on the final ballot, which would be to your point, Tony, that folks get on board and this becomes a show of unity. And so it's not just 89 or whatever it would have been, but up over 100. And there's this, kind of coming together, I think. But yeah, there was another cardinal who responded to somebody talking about, geographical blocks, who, rejected that idea and said, we're here to pick a pope for 2025, not a pope from, we're not thinking of this as the time for the papacy to return to Italy or which bloc has, but, so I think there's a sense that we don't want to be, confined by those blocks, but inevitably there are certain concerns from parts of the world, and those folks, those cardinals in those areas tend to know one another. So I think in North America there are 15, if I'm not mistaken, around the same number in South America, a few more in Central America. Africa's around that number. I think Asia has a few more than that. So, and it gives you maybe some idea.
I think there's not, in fact, a cardinal in Kabul, Afghanistan, right, as is in the film.
Yeah, I was it was in the run up to all this that I finally watched the film. It was on my list of things to do. And then, a couple of journalists asked me about it, and I had to say, I haven't watched it. So the Sunday before the conclave, I watched it. I thought it was very entertaining, but that's one of the things. So there are a number of things the film got right. I think, it gives you a good sense of the process of voting. I think a lot of that is correct. Some, of course, is over dramatized, which you would expect. But that actually, in the film, this cardinal shows up from Kabul, and he's not known to anybody, and he says that the Pope, before he died, named him Cardinal in pectore, which means in heart or in chest. That's a real thing. So because of the potential danger to a cardinal, a Pope could name a cardinal in pectore or without announcing it, and maybe tell only that cardinal himself, but keep it quiet. But what the film gets wrong is that no matter what notes or paperwork or whatever you have, if the Pope dies before making that public, that person is not admitted to the conclave. So that was a bit of a, he would not have been admitted. But a really entertaining thing, I thought. Right. It did seem also that to drive forward the drama of the film, they needed to have this person on the outside with whom the dean was communicating all the time. Like, this is, but I understand, it was like his private investigator, who's out there checking. That wouldn't happen,
So I'm wondering, in the time we have left, if we can just ask the question of ourselves of, are there lessons from the conclave process that might be of value in other contexts, particularly in representative democracy? I know that we've already articulated the reasons why it's quite distinct, and in particular, the sense of the potential for divine influence in the selection is just something we don't aspire to achieve in our democratic elections. But I wonder whether, as a sort of provocative discussion point, we might wonder whether an effort in the democratic system to more fully identify and respond to a kind of national will could be thought of in an analogous way. And are there better ways for our democratic elections to try to be influenced by an effort to, and I wouldn't have to say national will, that would be for presidential election, but a state will, the will of the electorate. And we talk about that as a concept all the time, but I'm not sure that we are in fact really coming close to identifying, and if we can identify, then following what is the will of the state, if we're talking about state level elections or whatever. And this goes back to our long-running effort to think about alternative electoral structures. And Terry, you said a few minutes ago that it would be nigh on impossible to use a 2/3 requirement for something like a presidential election. We just never get there. But I can imagine using something like approval voting in some other context, maybe not presidential election, but certainly in other contexts, as is being done in a few jurisdictions, in a way that might approach something more like identifying a sense of what the populace more generally is ready to embrace or is willing to embrace. So I've talked too long, but I'm wanting to see what other people might think here about lessons.
Well, Steve, I've had this thing about the fact that we've spread the election out to be long and not in person takes it, Matt, you kind of described it as thinking about what's best for their family and themselves. It removes that in your face idea that my vote is going to impact how everybody lives if I'm in the majority, right? That I am making a choice not just for me and my family. I'm saying that my choice for me and my family should also apply to Matt and Steve and Tim and Isra and Tony. And the more we spread that out, the less, I love standing in line with my neighbors because it reminds me of that community part of voting, not as just an individual act. But I am also a very weird thinker about these things, and I get that. But I think some of our processes make it feel more isolated and more insular and more individualistic than it really actually is or should be.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Terry. It's interesting. I think one of the things that makes the conclave so fascinating and something that captures the attention of the whole world when it happens is not just that it's the election of the Pope, though that's central, of course, to the interest level, but also it's the intimate nature of the election. Along the exact lines you said, Terry, if all the cardinals just voted absentee, it would not have the same interest level as it does when, in fact, the cardinals convene and meet face to face behind closed doors, which makes it a very riveting process. So it would be, it is at a certain level, maybe in American elections, the caucus system, which is much maligned, but it did have a feature similar to that because you met your neighbors and you talked about the candidates, and that is something I think is definitely missing in our elections today.
I'd love to hear more about what you said, Steve, about approval voting happening. How does that work? What shapes do we see of that? Where?
Yeah, so it's intended as a way to not try to identify just the winner through raw majority power, but instead to recognize that voters might have a number of different candidates that they'd be comfortable with and some that they aren't, and to let the process play out by really kind of eliminating the folks that aren't acceptable broadly. And so you can structure approval elections so that the voter gets to indicate from a slate of more than two, typically, a number of possibilities, every candidate that they'd be okay with and candidates they're not okay with. And then you can end up tabulating those. You have to be careful about it, as we do in any instance, but tabulating and see who is most, who's getting the most approval votes, if you will. Mm-hmm. And that process to me also seems more likely to lead to a result in which the unsuccessful candidates don't walk out bitter. I mean, as you were describing, Tim, the Cardinals don't walk out thinking, well, my candidate lost. They now have a pope. And I think approval voting might, at least in some instances, many instances, have a similar flavor in terms of the way in which the outcome is perceived.
And so ranked choice is a version of that or something different?
No, ranked choice is a little different yet, but with some aspirations to do something similar. And there are actually a number of different ranked choice systems. And often today, when people talk about ranked choice voting, they're specifically talking about instant runoff voting, or a way in which you take the rankings and you start eliminating from the bottom and reassigning the votes of the people at the bottom to the other candidates. But there are other ways of using ranked ballots, and we've talked a lot on previous podcast sessions about something we might call consensus voting, which is based on the French thinker, the Marquis de Condorcet, who invited reflection about what would happen if your elections were structured to generate the candidate who has the support of the most voters overall. And we could do that in our system today with ranked choice ballots, not by eliminating the lowest number of first place votes and reassigning, but by just seeing, based on the rankings, who is most successful when put head to head against everybody else. But there are also yet other ways to tabulate ranked choice ballots. So it's not a uniform system, but it's very much attempting to wrestle with the problem of multiple candidates, not just two, in which voters may have a variety of different ways of ranking them and expressing preferences. And to come back to the conclave, what's so different about the conclave is that the eligible voters are so small that they have the opportunity to engage in this conversation with one another, and that can then affect how they vote. But that is quite like the caucus. And I too was hoping we'd get there for a minute and talk about how in our system today, caucus processes replicate that same dynamic, I think. Tony, you've been part of a caucus on occasion, I imagine.
That's right, Steve. And the caucus history is fascinating because it really historically was an event that for 2 hours or 3 hours every 4 years since at least the 70s here in Iowa would bring people together to talk about who they want to be the president of the United States. A really extraordinary, remarkable thing. But of course, the flip side is there are a lot of downsides to caucuses. The big one being a lot of people, it's just impractical. They can't give up 2 hours on a Tuesday night in February. And so the Cardinals, I think, had a real advantage that they all were able to attend.
And forced to be stuck in the room, locked in, as it were.
Right, for more than 2 hours.
The conclave started, I mean, I think it was 3 years the Cardinals had not come to a decision. And so the people, it was an external pressure. The people said, look, we're locking you in and we're going to give you bread and water until you come up with a decision.
That was a practical solution.
I suppose that party conventions, too, to a certain degree, provide opportunity for the same kind of dialogue, discussion, but still in a way that's different from a caucus.
Was the electoral college even sort of that kind of concept early on because it wasn't as locked in as it is now, right?
Well, but I don't think there was ever a sense that the electors of one state would be talking with the electors of another state. Right? That was never really the way it worked.
But the presidential nomination process prior to the primaries, I think, Steve, it is an interesting because, like the key players were able to meet face to face and discuss who they thought the party nominee should be, Abraham Lincoln in 1860 or Franklin Roosevelt in 32. But the other element that I think is a striking parallel with the conclave is that there was no transparency. The smoke-filled rooms, the doors were shut, and it's just the key figures getting to talk very freely, very forthrightly about the candidates. And so we live in an era that demands transparency, but I think there are some advantages to the decision makers being freed from the prying eyes of the media to have a frank discussion. Sometimes I think it leads to a better outcome than if the media is there, then just naturally people start to play to the crowd and don't really exercise the same level of independent judgment as they do in a secret proceeding.
It is interesting, and this, of course, this is your territory. So, but it is the case right early in our republic that campaigning was seen as a faux pas as well, right? I mean, and that emerged over time. I mean, as I was saying earlier, the conclave, if you're seen to be campaigning, that is like disqualifier number one. This is, you don't want somebody as pope who wants to be pope, and so if you want it, you have to at least be quiet about it, And early on, there was a sense of that here too, huh? I mean, with presidential elections, that you wouldn't openly campaign.
That's right. Candidates were said to stand for office rather than run. And in one of Ohio's favorite sons, William McKinley, really made an art out of running from his front porch, where his political managers would bring in different constituencies, like Irish voters from Cincinnati or Italian voters from New York, or representatives of them, to meet him at his front porch, which then, of course, would be reported in the newspapers around the country. But it showed even as late as the late 1800s, there was a squeamishness about candidates going out and and asking for people's votes directly. But I think Theodore Roosevelt kind of got us past that issue. We've never gone back.
There's so many fascinating parallels here to other leadership structures, and you can see historically that there might well be connections. You mentioned early on, Tim, that in theory, the cardinals might select as a new pope somebody from outside their number as long as it's a baptized member of the church. And that was making me think of the way in which the U.S. House of Representatives can choose its speaker as potentially somebody who's not an actual member of the House. Mm-hmm. Has there been a time when the Pope has been chosen from outside of the cardinals who are voting?
Yes, it's been a very long time. There was actually, I'm thinking of, and this may not be the most recent time, but I'm thinking of Celestine V, who was the Pope, the last Pope to resign before Benedict in the 14th century, I think. He was like plucked out of a monastery to come be Pope. He was a compromise candidate for sure. And people thought, well, he would be, and he was in a monastery, and he said, well, I'll take this burden if that's what, God wants. And he just couldn't do it. I mean, it just wasn't in him. So eventually he resigned. There have been several occasions actually, but not recently.
Well, this has been really interesting and fun to think about some of those historical parallels and current parallels. Any final thoughts?
I just want to thank Tim for joining us. What a fascinating topic. It's so interesting to think about the parallels with our elections and of course the significant differences.
Yeah.
Oh, it's been so much fun. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, Tim. So we'll leave it there for this episode, and we'll look forward to our next episode of Law and Democracy. Thank you, everyone.